At my 60th birthday dinner, I reached for my chair at the head of the table, but my son-in-law yanked my hand away, shoved past me, and dropped into my seat. With every eye on him, he leaned back, smirked, and said, "Your time as head of this family is over, old man." My daughter didn't protest. She lowered her gaze, letting the humiliation settle like a knife in my chest. I'm Seth. We've seen it all, haven't we? If you believe in life's balance, click subscribe and write your first name and where you're from. Let your voice be heard. At my 60th birthday dinner, the lights glowed soft and golden, the kind that makes crystal glasses shine like stars. The table was lined with silver cutlery, roasted meats, and bowls of vegetables arranged with care. It should have been a celebration of endurance, of family, of the years I carried us through storms. Instead, it became the night I learned my place in their eyes had already been erased. Mark, the man my daughter married, was late, as usual. He strode in with his cologne cloud, announcing him before his voice did. He shook hands with cousins, kissed aunts on the cheek, all smiles and charm. But when he reached the head of the table, my chair, he paused. I stood, hand on the wooden backrest, ready to sit again after greeting an old family friend. Mark's grip clamped down on my wrist, not a handshake, a pull. He yanked my hand away from my chair with a casual force that shocked me. Then he slid into the seat, leaned back like a king, and spread his arms as if the table itself belonged to him. Silence rippled. Forks paused midair. Even the children sensed the shift. Mark's smirk cut through the room before his words did. Your time as head of this family is over, old man. Gasps, some nervous laughter, my heart pounding in my ears. I searched for Emily's face, my daughter, my only child. She didn't look at me. Her eyes dropped to her lap, to the napkin she twisted between her fingers. She didn't say a word. Not to stop him, not to defend me, not even to soften the blow. In that moment, I realized the nightmare of every aging parent. To be replaced in your own home, silenced in front of your own blood. And worse, the silence of the one person you sacrificed everything for. I stayed standing longer than I should have, hand hanging awkwardly at my side, eyes fixed on the man who had stolen my seat. The head of the table, the place where I had sat for decades, was now his stage, and everyone else played along. My brother-in-law chuckled nervously and muttered, "Guess times are changing." Someone else raised a glass as though this were part of the entertainment. The laughter was not cruel, but it was cowardly, and cowardice stings just as deep. I lowered myself into another chair, further down the table, the scrape of wood on tile echoing louder than the chatter that tried to resume. The food had no taste. Every bite turned to dust in my mouth. Mark thrived on it. He carved the roast with exaggerated gestures, poured wine like a host, told stories about his big plans for the future. Plans for Emily's career, plans for investments, plans for family traditions, his words, not mine. I waited for Emily to cut in, to say, "We already have traditions. My father built them," but she only nodded. Her agreement landed heavier than Mark's insults. The rest of the evening blurred into a string of small humiliations. Mark toasting to new leadership, cousins raising their glasses, my nephews laughing at his jokes. No one remembered that it was my birthday, my night. The cake arrived, candles lit, but even then, it felt like I was blowing them out at someone else's table. When the evening ended, the house was quiet again, but the echo of his words over, old man stayed, like a blade lodged between my ribs, and Emily's silence hurt far more than his smirk ever could. The morning after the dinner, I found myself wandering through the house like a stranger. The photographs on the walls, Emily at her graduation, Emily at her wedding, mocked me with frozen smiles. I had built this house back up with my own hands after storms ripped it apart. Every beam, every nail chosen with care. I thought it would always be a safe place for my daughter to come home to. Now, it felt like a stage where I had been cast aside. Emily came into the kitchen, still in her silk robe from the night before. She avoided my eyes as she poured coffee. Finally, I asked, "Why didn't you say anything last night?" Her spoon clinked against the mug. A pause, then, "Dad, you make everything so dramatic. Mark was just joking. You need to let go of control. Times are different now." Joking. That word burned hotter than the coffee I spilled on my hand. She had watched me be humiliated, dismissed in front of everyone, and she called it a joke. I wanted to remind her of the nights I sat by her hospital bed when she was a child, the medals I pawned to cover her tuition, the mortgage I signed so she could chase her law degree. Instead, I stayed silent. Because what good were words if she already chose not to hear them? Mark entered then, crisp in his suit, phone pressed to his ear. He kissed Emily on the cheek, glanced at me, and winked as if last night's performance had been a rehearsal for a much bigger show. Then he walked out the door, leaving his cologne and his arrogance hanging in the air. Emily sipped her coffee, eyes still averted. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. The word settled into me like a warning. Something told me this was only the beginning of a longer, crueler play. Days turned into weeks, and the shift became permanent. My seat at the table remained Mark's, number des. At first, I thought it was temporary, a rude mistake that would correct itself with time. But soon, every gathering told me otherwise. Thanksgiving came. I carved the turkey every year since Emily was old enough to remember. This time, Mark stood at the head with the knife in hand. He looked at me before slicing, a smirk tugging at his lips, as though daring me to challenge him. Emily passed him the gravy boat like it had always belonged in his hands. Christmas followed. I used to read the story by the fireplace while Emily curled against her mother's side. That night, Mark read it instead, his voice booming while Emily sat beside him, laughing at his dramatic tones. The younger cousins clapped, and I sat alone in the corner, my voice swallowed by the crackle of the fire. It wasn't just holidays. Mark began inserting himself into the decisions of the house. Repairs, bills, even the family cabin I had rebuilt plank by plank after a storm nearly tore it down. He talked about renovations as if it were his project, his property. One evening I overheard him on the phone. "Once Emily and I put our names on everything, the old man won't matter. He's already fading out." Fading out. Like I was a photograph left in the sun. I wanted to believe Emily didn't hear those words, that she didn't know the depth of his arrogance. But she did. And she stayed. Every tradition I built, every memory I tried to protect Mark was erasing them piece by piece, and Emily was helping him hold the eraser. The final blow came quietly, without theatrics, but it cut deeper than any public insult. One afternoon, I came home to find Emily and Mark at the kitchen table, papers spread before them. Deeds, bank statements, contracts. My contracts, the ones I kept in the safe. Mark looked up first, that same smirk pulling at his face. "We're just organizing things, Dad. Don't worry. We'll take care of everything from here." "Ho," said it. Emily's eyes flicked up, then back down, as if she couldn't bear to watch me register the betrayal. She was signing my name with a practiced hand on documents that moved the cabin and the family savings into their control. I stood there, breath shallow, as Mark tapped the pen against the table. "You've carried the torch long enough. Time to pass it on. We're the future now." It wasn't just my seat. It wasn't just the holidays. It was everything, my sacrifices, my years of service, my home, my legacy. Piece by piece, they were stripping it away, and Emily was letting it happen. That night, I sat alone in the cabin I had rebuilt with my bare hands. The wooden walls seemed to close in on me, whispering the truth I didn't want to face. I had raised a daughter who no longer saw me as her father, but as an obstacle in her husband's rise. And in that silence I swore to myself I would not beg for scraps of respect. I would not fade quietly into the shadows. They wanted me erased, but they had forgotten one thing. I was not done yet. I remember the first time I held Emily in my arms. She was so small, so fragile, her mother exhausted from the long hours of labor. I whispered a promise to her before she could even open her eyes. "I will protect you, always." And I did, for decades. When her mother fell ill, I left behind the chance to command a fleet, to wear another stripe on my shoulder. 25 years in the Navy, and I was offered more. But Emily needed me more. I traded medals for hospital bills, uniforms for nights spent by a hospice bed. I chose to come home. I remember the sound of the auctioneer's gavel when I sold my service medals, bronze and silver, that meant the world to me but meant nothing compared to her tuition. The crowd clapped politely, unaware they were applauding a father's sacrifice. I mortgaged the house, too. Signed away years of security so Emily could walk through the gates of her law school without debt shackling her ankles. I told her, "Don't worry about the cost. Just be brilliant. Just make it count." And she did. She became the first Reynolds to wear a cap and gown from that university. I clapped the loudest, tears in my eyes, because every sleepless night, every dollar sacrificed, every scar from my service, it all felt worth it. I built everything so she could stand tall. And now she stood taller, but not beside me. Not for me. For him. The memories of what I gave her haunted me more than Mark's insults ever could. Because betrayal from a stranger cuts once. Betrayal from your own child cuts every single time you remember what you gave. I remember the nights when Emily was still a girl, coughing so hard the doctors warned it could scar her lungs. I sat by her bedside, counting the seconds between breaths, terrified one might be her last. I told her stories from my Navy days, not the bloody ones, but the ones with storms and stars, so she would drift to sleep thinking of constellations instead of sickness. Her mother's illness made the house heavy with grief, but I fought to keep Emily's world light. I cooked meals I didn't know how to cook, burned half of them, and laughed it off so she would laugh too. I tied her shoelaces wrong, but taught her how to march straight. I stitched her soccer uniforms when we couldn't afford new ones. Telling her the patches made her stronger. I remember every sacrifice that didn't have a dollar sign attached. Every bedtime story when I was dead tired. Every smile I faked so she wouldn't see my fear. Every time I swallowed loneliness so she could feel safe. When she grew older, I kept building her world. I took extra shifts as a security consultant, my body aching from the years of service, so she could have a new laptop, a better phone, the things her classmates had. She never knew the hours I worked, or the way my back screamed when I stood too long. I never told her. Because that's what fathers do, they carry the weight and never complain. And all those memories came crashing back the moment she lowered her eyes at that dinner table, refusing to meet mine. I remembered the girl who once clung to my hand in the hospital, and realized she had let it go for good. I remember the storm that nearly tore our old family cabin apart. The roof caved in, windows shattered, beams rotted with rain. Everyone said it was beyond saving. Sell it, they told me. Walk away. But I couldn't. That cabin was more than wood and nails. It was where Emily learned to fish, where her mother used to hum by the fireplace, where we scattered ashes when grief demanded a place to rest. So I rebuilt it, board by board. I worked through winters so cold my hands cracked open, summers so humid sweat soaked through my shirt before noon. I spent every spare dollar, every bit of my pension, to restore what the storm had tried to take. Emily used to come by while I worked. She'd sit on the porch, books in her lap, and I'd catch her smiling at me through the dust. Once, she said, "Dad, you're building this for me, aren't you?" I laughed. For us. Always for us. Is that? When I finally hammered in the last nail, I stood back and looked at that cabin like it was another child of mine, fragile, but standing strong again. I thought I was giving Emily a place to return to, no matter where life took her. But at that birthday dinner, when Mark raised his glass and talked about their property, their investments, I realized Emily had already forgotten the years of sweat and blood poured into that wood. She had forgotten, or worse, she had chosen to forget. And I sat there, remembering every blister, every cut, every dollar spent, while watching them plan to take it all like it had been theirs from the start. I remember the day Emily brought Mark home for the first time. He was polished, too polished, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. But I kept my doubts to myself. Emily's eyes lit up around him, and after years of carrying grief on her shoulders, I wanted her to feel light again. Mark shook my hand with a grip that lingered, testing, measuring. He called me "sir," a little too smoothly, praised my military service with the ease of a man reciting lines. Still, I opened my door. I cooked dinner, poured wine, told the old Navy stories that usually drew laughs. He laughed too louder than everyone else, as if he wanted to drown out the others. When Emily announced their engagement, I swallowed my unease. I told myself love is supposed to be blind, that fathers are supposed to let go. I gave my blessing, even though something in me whispered caution. I remember her wedding day. She looked radiant, her mother's smile on her face. But when it came time for the father-daughter dance, Mark kept cutting in, first with a joke, then with a tug, then with that same smirk he wears now. My moment, our moment, stolen before the song had even ended. People laughed then, too. I forced a smile, told myself it was harmless. But deep down, I knew, some men don't steal with money. They steal with moments. And sitting at my birthday dinner all those years later, watching him plant himself in my chair, I realized he had been stealing since the very beginning. Only this time, Emily wasn't just letting him, she was helping him. I remember the silence after my wife passed. The house was too big, too quiet, too full of memories that cut like glass. Emily was in her second year of college, miles away, and I didn't want her to know how empty I felt. I sent care packages, wrote cheerful letters, tucked cash inside envelopes even when I didn't have much to spare. I told her, "Focus on your studies, I'm fine." I wasn't fine. I spent nights staring at the empty side of the bed, listening for a voice that would never return. I filled the hours with work, with repairs, with anything that kept me from sinking, but every dollar I earned went to her, every ounce of strength bent toward keeping her future bright. I remember selling the last of my wife's jewelry pieces she adored, pieces I had promised to keep for one more semester's tuition. I stood in the pawn shop, hand trembling as I slid the box across the counter. The man counted bills with indifference. To him it was just gold. To me it was a piece of my heart. But I never told Emily. I wanted her to believe everything came easily, that she didn't have to carry the weight of my grief or my sacrifices. She walked across that graduation stage without ever knowing what it cost, and I clapped louder than anyone, my chest swollen with pride, telling myself it was worth it. But now, when she looks through me to follow Mark's lead, I wonder, was I too good at hiding the cost? Did she mistake my silence for abundance? Did she think respect was optional because I never asked for it out loud? That memory haunts me most, because the pain I swallowed, then the loneliness, the grief, was easier to bear than the silence she gives me now. I remember the look on Emily's face when she got her first job offer out of law school. She ran into the kitchen, waving the letter in the air, laughing and crying at the same time. I lifted her off the ground like she was still that little girl in soccer cleats, and for a moment the years of sacrifice felt light. All the mortgages, the sleepless nights, the aches in my bones, it all seemed worth it. I remember driving her to that office on her first day. I waited outside like a school drop-off, watching her straighten her blazer and march inside. She didn't look back, and I told myself that was good. It meant she was confident. It meant she was ready. But as the months passed, her visits grew fewer, phone calls shorter. She said she was busy, and I believed her. I told myself this is what success looks like. That distance is just part of growing up. Then came Mark. He slipped into her life with ease, filling the spaces where I used to stand. He picked her up from work, brought her flowers, whispered promises I'll never know, and just like that, my place in her world shifted from center to shadow. I remember trying to ignore it. I told myself, this is what fathers do. They step back so their daughters can step forward. But the truth gnawed at me. I hadn't just stepped back. I had been pushed, and now, every time I see her at Mark's side, nodding along to his schemes, I remember that moment in the kitchen, her joy, her pride, and wonder how she can't see the difference between the man who built her foundation and the man who wants to strip it away. I remember the last real conversation Emily and I had before Mark came into the picture. We were sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset over the lake. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Dad, you've always been my rock. No matter what happens, I'll never forget what you've done for me." Those words carried me through the hardest days, through the long nights alone after her mother's passing, through the years of rebuilding both a house and a life. I held on to them like scripture. But words, I've learned, are fragile things. They break under pressure. They vanish under influence. They can be rewritten by someone else's voice whispering in the dark. At my birthday dinner, when she looked down at her lap instead of meeting my eyes, I thought of that porch, that sunset, that promise, and I realized it had expired. I remembered all the times I told myself Emily would always come back to me, that the bond between father and daughter was unbreakable. But bonds can be bent, reshaped, twisted, until they no longer resemble what they once were. And as I sat there listening to Mark declare me finished, I realized Emily had already chosen. She had traded her rock for a mirage, her promise for silence. What I remember most now isn't the porch or the sunset. It's the silence that swallowed me whole in a room full of family. The silence of the one person I thought would never turn away. After that night, I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped waiting for Emily to see through the man she married. Instead, I started watching, listening, quietly. Mark was careless. Arrogant men always are. He spoke too loudly on phone calls, bragged too freely after a few glasses of wine. I began to notice the cracks in his charm, the little boasts he didn't mean for me to hear. One evening I sat in the den while he paced the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear. He thought I was asleep. I heard him laugh and say, "Once Emily's name is tied to the assets, the old man won't have a say. The house, the cabin, it's all just paperwork waiting to be signed." Another time, after too many drinks at a family barbecue, he slapped a cousin on the back and said, "You're looking at the future patriarch. The Reynolds name is mine now. The old man just doesn't know it yet." Each word was a nail in the coffin of my patience, but I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I opened a drawer in my study, pulled out an old digital recorder I used during my security consulting days, and slipped it into my pocket. From then on, every careless boast, every cruel whisper, every scheme he thought was private, I captured them all. And with each recording, I felt a strange calm settle over me. They thought I was fading, irrelevant, but I was building something stronger than their schemes. Evidence, proof, the weapon they would never see coming. The first weeks of recording were almost too easy. Mark strutted around like a man untouchable, unaware of the tiny device in my pocket, the one that turned his arrogance into ammunition. I caught him bragging to a colleague about how he could steer Emily into signing whatever he needed. His voice dripped with pride when he said, "She trusts me completely. She thinks everything I do is for us. But really it's for me. For my future. To mine indecisions." I recorded him boasting at a dinner party, glass raised high. The Reynolds fortune, what's left of it is mine to control. I just have to play the long game. And I'm very good at long games. People laughed, clinked glasses, thought it was just a joke. But I knew better. Jokes are often truths with a mask on. Late one night, when Emily had gone to bed, I overheard him in the living room speaking on the phone. His words were sharp, low, meant for someone he trusted. The old man doesn't have much time left. He looks weaker every day. Once he's out of the picture, we'll have everything tied up neat. Trust me, it's practically ours already. Those words tightened something in my chest, not fear but clarity. He wasn't just circling my assets. He was circling my life, my very existence. I pressed stop on the recorder that night and stared at it in my hand. It was small, unremarkable. But inside, it held his downfall. For the first time in months I slept without bitterness, because I knew his own mouth would be the rope he hung himself with. I didn't stop at recordings. A soldier knows you don't win a war with one weapon, you prepare an arsenal. Mark was sloppy with his emails. Emily had shown me once, early in their marriage, how he used the same password for everything. She thought it was funny. I thought it was careless. Years later, it was still the same. One night, while they slept, I tried it on his laptop. It opened like an unlocked door. Inside, I found threads of correspondence that turned my stomach. Messages to a financial advisor about shifting assets quietly into accounts with only his name. Notes about convincing Emily to sign over partial rights to the cabin and the family home. One email even read, "Once Reynolds is out of the way, I'll have full control. She won't question me. She never does." I printed everything. Dozens of pages, time-stamped, signed by his arrogance. But that wasn't the end. His calendar revealed meetings with people Emily didn't know, contractors, developers, even real estate agents. He wasn't just plotting to take what I built. He was planning to sell it off, brick by brick, to fund his own empire. I sat in my study, the glow of the printer washing the room in pale light, listening to the steady hum of paper sliding out. Evidence piled higher and higher on the desk until it looked less like documents and more like a verdict. Mark thought he was clever, untouchable. But what I found in his files proved otherwise. He wasn't just scheming. He was leaving footprints all over his crimes. And I was following every step. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Mark wasn't just trying to replace me at the table, he was trying to erase me from existence. I discovered he had already met with a lawyer. Not Emily's firm, but one across town. The kind that handled quiet transfers of property and estate planning. He had drawn up drafts that listed him as a trustee of my assets, with Emily as a secondary signatory. He was planning to control everything, even after I was gone. One draft used words that chilled me. Incapacitated, unfit, diminished. Words meant to strip me of authority while I was still breathing. I found invoices, 2 payments to private investigators. He was digging into my finances, my medical history, even my military records. He wanted to paint me as weak, unstable, unworthy of trust. And with Emily standing beside him, nodding, the lie could have become truth. I copied every document, every invoice, every draft. I kept the originals where they were, careful not to tip my hand. But in my files at home, I had a parallel universe, the one where his ambition was naked, undeniable, ready to be exposed. The recordings captured his arrogance. The emails revealed his schemes, and these legal drafts proved intent. Step by step, he was tightening the noose. But with each step, I was untying it, looping it back around his own neck. He thought he was preparing my obituary. What he didn't realize was that I was writing his confession. I began to notice something else. Mark couldn't keep his greed contained. He bragged not just to colleagues, but to friends, even strangers. And every time he did, I was there, silent, with my recorder tucked in my pocket. One night at a bar, after too many drinks, he leaned across the table to an old friend and said, "The old man's slipping. He doesn't even realize he's already signed away half of it. Once Emily's fully on board, he won't have a dime to his name. Hell, I might let him keep a room if he behaves." The friend laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But the recorder didn't laugh. It captured every word. Another night, during a family gathering, he cornered one of Emily's cousins. "Stick close to me," he said, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "Once I'm running things, there will be opportunities. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. Do or wow from mine. Till do or doesn't tend chapter." He spoke like a man already crowned, already enthroned at the head of a kingdom he hadn't built. But kingdoms built on lies collapse fast, especially when the walls have ears. I listened to those recordings late at night, each one sharpening my resolve. They weren't just words. They were daggers he had thrown himself, and I was catching every one. By the time I was done, I didn't just have evidence. I had a library of his arrogance, and I knew one day soon I would open those shelves for the world to see. It wasn't enough to gather Mark's words. Words can be denied, twisted. I needed allies, people who would see what I saw, hear what I heard, and confirm it without question. So I turned to the one place Mark thought no one in the family ever paid attention to: the numbers, bank statements, tax filings, property assessments. He was sloppy there too. His arrogance made him reckless. I noticed transfers that didn't add up small amounts at first. Then larger sums shifted into accounts Emily didn't know about. I brought the documents to an old friend from my Navy days, a man who had become a forensic accountant. He studied the papers, listened to a few of the recordings, and leaned back in his chair. "He's hanging himself," he said. "You don't even need to push. Just give him the rope." That was when I knew the fight wasn't just mine anymore. The evidence wasn't a secret stash in my drawer. It was a case, solid enough to stand in daylight. Mark hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the law. And the law, when wielded with precision, is sharper than any blade. I left my friend's office with a folder in my hand and something stronger than anger in my chest: certainty. Mark thought he was orchestrating my downfall. But all along, he had been composing the soundtrack to his own. The final piece came almost by accident. Emily had left her briefcase open one evening, papers spilling across the coffee table. Among them was a draft will, one she hadn't written, but Mark had clearly pushed her to prepare. My name was there, but not as protector or trustee. I was listed as a dependent, a liability. Reading it, my stomach turned. I wasn't the father who raised her anymore, not in their eyes. I was an obstacle to be managed, filed away, signed out of relevance. But that document gave me something Mark could never undo: confirmation. He wasn't just whispering about the future. He had put pen to paper, shaping it into law, twisting Emily's trust into a weapon. I photographed every page, every signature line, every clause that hinted at his manipulation. And when I slipped the papers back into her case, I knew I had the final nail. The recordings were damning, the emails undeniable, the legal drafts indisputable, but this Emily's own hand, guided by Mark's schemes, was the proof that would shatter the illusion for everyone else. I leaned back in my chair that night, the weight of months of watching and listening pressing down on me. Yet for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready. Mark thought he had cornered me. What he didn't realize was that I had already mapped every exit, sealed every door, and built the case that would trap him inside his own ambition. The war was no longer about survival. It was about exposure. And soon, very soon, the world would see Mark for what he really was. The night I decided to strike back, I didn't shout. I didn't slam doors or demand explanations. That would have given him power, made me look desperate. No, this had to be cold, deliberate, undeniable. I laid out everything on my desk: recordings, emails, bank statements, legal drafts. I organized them like a battlefield map, each piece a weapon aimed at a weak point. Then I called a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but one who had once served under me in the Navy, a man who still called me commander even after all these years. He listened in silence as I laid the evidence before him. When the last recording played, Mark's voice dripping with arrogance, my lawyer looked up and said, "Sir, this isn't just family drama. This is fraud. This is coercion. You have him by the throat." We spent hours crafting a strategy, not just to confront him, but to dismantle him legally, socially, financially. We would file motions, leak recordings, alert Emily's firm. Step by step, we would strip away the mask he wore so confidently. When I left that office, the folder in my hand felt less like paper and more like steel. For the first time since that birthday dinner, I wasn't the old man fading into the shadows. I was the commander again leading a mission, only this time the battlefield was my family, and the enemy was sitting at my table. The first strike wasn't loud. It wasn't even public. It was a whisper slipped into the right ears. I sent a copy of the recordings to Emily's firm, not all of them, just enough to crack the surface. Mark's voice, drunk and laughing, bragging about manipulating Emily into signing documents she didn't understand. His boasts about steering her career for his benefit. His talk of siphoning assets from the Reynolds name into accounts she would never see. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Within days, I heard the stirrings. Whispers in the hallways, clients asking questions, partners exchanging wary looks when Mark accompanied Emily to events. The polished smile he wore so proudly began to falter under the weight of suspicion. At home, he grew restless, pacing more, drinking more, snapping at Emily when she asked simple questions. I watched from the corner of the room, silent, as he unraveled thread by thread. He didn't know I had pulled the string. He only knew the seams were splitting, and while he raged at shadows, I was already preparing the next blow. Because exposure, like war, works best when it comes in waves, each one stronger than the last, until the enemy has nowhere left to stand. The second wave came heavier, deliberate. I released more recordings this time to the family. I chose a Sunday morning when everyone was home. Cousins, uncles, aunts, all of them received the same message. A simple email with no signature, no explanation, just an audio file. Mark's voice, unmistakable, slurring over whiskey as he spat. The old man's nothing but dead weight. Once I'm in charge, I'll sell the cabin, the house, all of it. Emily won't fight me, she never does. The family will follow me or be left behind. The fallout was immediate. My phone buzzed all day with calls I didn't answer. Some voices trembled with anger, others with disbelief. But one thing was certain. The image Mark had crafted of the devoted husband, the ambitious partner, the charming son-in-law, it shattered with a single play button. By evening, I heard he had stormed out of Emily's office after a heated call with one of her uncles. He returned home red-faced, shouting about betrayal, swearing someone was framing him. But lies sound weak when the truth is recorded in your own voice. Emily avoided my eyes at dinner that night. She didn't defend him. She didn't defend me either. She just sat in silence, trapped between the man she married and the father she had abandoned. And in that silence, I knew the war was turning. Mark had allies once. Now, they were scattering like leaves in the wind. The third strike was a hammer blow. I compiled every document, every email, every bank transfer Mark had hidden and sent them directly to Emily's law firm, addressed to the managing partners. Not just whispers now, proof, black and white. Numbers and signatures that tied Mark's schemes to fraud and coercion. It took less than 24 hours for the fallout to begin. Mark was called in, blindsided by questions he couldn't answer. Partners who once smiled at him now stared like predators circling prey. His protests, "It's out of context! Someone's framing me!" sounded hollow against his own emails, his own numbers. By the next morning, he was suspended from any involvement in Emily's cases. His name became poison in the office halls. Clients who had shaken his hand days earlier now refused to take his calls. But I wasn't finished. That same morning, every relative close and distant received another package. A collection of recordings, neatly arranged, with transcripts attached. No commentary, no signature. Just Mark's own words, mocking the family, belittling Emily, ridiculing me. By noon, his phone was silent. No allies, no friends, no partners. His empire of charm had collapsed overnight. And as he sat in the ruins, still too arrogant to see who had struck the blow, I prepared for the final confrontation, the moment where silence would break and he would finally hear my voice again. Mark lashed out when the walls started closing in. He shouted at Emily, accused her of betrayal, demanded to know who was sabotaging him. He stormed through the house, rifling through drawers, convinced there was a traitor inside his circle. But he never looked at me. I sat quietly in my chair, the one he had once stolen from me, sipping coffee while he unraveled. He paced back and forth, red-faced, sweat soaking through his shirt, muttering about enemies. He was a cornered animal, snapping at shadows. At one point, he stopped and glared at me. "You think this is funny, old man?" I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "No," I said softly. "I think it's inevitable." The words rattled him more than a scream would have. He turned away, slamming doors, dialing numbers that no longer answered. Every ally had abandoned him. Every escape was blocked. Emily sat at the table, pale, silent, watching the man she thought she loved tear himself apart. She looked at me once, just once, and for a flicker of a moment, I saw something doubt. Not enough to undo the years of distance, but enough to remind her that truth has a way of breaking through the cracks. I didn't need to fight Mark with fists or fury. The truth had already done the damage. All I had to do was sit still and let him destroy himself. When rage failed him, Mark tried charm again. That was his weapon of choice. The mask he had worn so long he thought it could still save him. He put on a smile, poured glasses of wine, and said to the family, "You all know me. You know I'd never say those things." Someone twisted my words. "You can't believe a bitter old man over me." But this time, no one lifted their glass. No one laughed at his jokes. The room was thick with doubt, with shame. Even Emily didn't nod along. She sat stiff, eyes on the table, refusing to play her part. I watched him falter, watched his voice crack when silence met him where applause once lived. He looked around, searching for allies who were no longer there. And that's when I moved. I stood, slow but steady, and placed a folder on the table. Inside were the transcripts, the bank transfers, the drafts of legal documents he had tried to keep buried. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. His own handwriting, his own signature, his own arrogance spilled across the pages. Mark's face drained of color. His hand trembled as he flipped through the evidence, each page louder than any accusation I could have spoken. Finally, I broke the silence. "This isn't revenge, Mark. This is exposure." And in that moment, the mask slipped for good. The man who had smirked in my chair at my 60th birthday sat small, cornered, stripped of every illusion of power. The confrontation spread beyond the walls of our home. Once the evidence was out, it traveled fast through family circles, professional networks, and eventually, the community Mark had tried so hard to impress. Clients withdrew deals. Friends stopped returning his calls. Even social invitations, the kind he thrived on, evaporated. His name, once polished like glass, was now sharp and dangerous to touch. Emily's firm made their decision quickly. They couldn't risk being tainted by his shadow. Mark was barred from stepping foot inside, his access revoked, his presence erased from their future. Whispers of disbarment began to circle, not for Emily, but for him, the parasite who had attached himself to her career. I never lifted a finger in public. I didn't need to. The proof I had gathered did the work. Every room he walked into, people already knew. Every handshake he reached for, hands stayed in pockets. And while he fought to salvage his image, I stayed quiet. I tended the cabin. I polished the metals I had left. I walked the property he once claimed as his own. The land was steady beneath my boots, unlike the quicksand he had built his life upon. Mark had taken my chair once, tried to take my name, my home, my legacy. But now, every circle that once welcomed him had turned cold. He wasn't head of anything. He was nothing but a man exposed. And exposure, I learned, is more permanent than any wound. The final act didn't happen in a courtroom or at a dinner table. It happened in silence, with only 3 people present: Mark, Emily, and me. We sat in the living room, the same one where he had once strutted with his phone, bragging about my downfall. Now he sat hunched, eyes bloodshot, hands twitching against his knees. Emily sat beside him, but not close. There was space between them now, a gulf carved by the truth. I laid one last envelope on the coffee table. Inside were the certified copies of everything I had gathered, neatly bound and notarized. A copy had already been filed with my lawyer, another with the state. This was just a courtesy to show him the walls were sealed. He stared at it but didn't touch it. Emily finally reached for the folder, flipping through page after page, her face draining of color as the weight of it sank in. When she looked up, her eyes finally met mine, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far heavier: shame. Mark tried to speak, to spin, to charm, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time he had no script, no stage, no audience willing to applaud. I stood, slow and steady. My voice was calm. "You wanted my seat, Mark. You can keep it. But understand this power isn't taken by force. It's lost by truth. And the truth is already out. This is scribe. I walked away before either of them could answer. The chair, the table, the house they could sit in the ruins if they wished. My war was over, and I had won it without firing a shot. The house feels different now, not quieter, but lighter, as if the walls themselves exhaled once the poison was gone. I walk the halls without flinching at the memories of being pushed aside. My chair at the table sits empty sometimes, and that's fine. I don't need to occupy it every night to prove I belong. Mark doesn't sit there anymore. He doesn't sit anywhere near this family. His name is spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. The man who once declared himself head of the family is now an absence, a cautionary tale. Emily stays away. I don't chase her. That part of me, the part that begged for her approval, her loyalty died the night she chose silence over me. I don't hate her. I don't forgive her. I simply let her go. I have the cabin, the home I rebuilt with my own hands. I have my medals, the ones I refused to sell, polished and gleaming in their case. I have peace, not the fragile peace of pretending everything is fine, but the kind that comes after battle, earned, steady, real. I gave, I lost, I fought, and now I stand alone, but not broken. What I have now is mine, and no one, not even blood, will ever take it from me again. The calls still come, though less often now. Relatives who once laughed at Mark's jokes ring me late at night, their voices heavy with guilt. They say things like, "We should have spoken up," or "We didn't realize how far it had gone." I listen. I don't lash out, but I don't comfort them either. Their silence at that birthday dinner was as loud as Mark's insult. They chose their side when they clinked glasses and raised toasts to his so-called leadership. Now they want absolution. I have none to give. I nod. I end the calls politely. And when I set the phone down, I feel no obligation to pick it up again. Family is more than blood. Family is loyalty, sacrifice, memory. Those who abandoned me forfeited the right to call themselves mine. What I have now is smaller, yes, fewer chairs filled at the table, fewer voices in the halls. But what remains is honest. The cabin stands. The metals shine. My conscience is clear. And when I sit on the porch at night, the lake reflecting the stars, I feel something better than forgiveness. I feel freedom. There are mornings when I wake before dawn, the habit of a soldier that never left me. I brew my coffee, step onto the porch, and breathe in the silence. For years, that silence felt like loneliness. Now it feels like clarity. The cabin holds steady, every beam a reminder of the storms I've already survived. When I run my hand along the wooden walls, I don't think of the day Mark called it his. I think of the nights I bled into it, the sweat that sank into the floorboards, the promise I made to myself that this place would always stand. And it does, because of me. Sometimes neighbors stop by. They ask about repairs, about the garden, about fishing. They don't ask about Mark, they don't ask about Emily, and I don't bring them up. My life isn't defined by what I lost anymore. It's defined by what I refuse to let be stolen. I don't crave their respect. I don't crave their pity. I stand on ground I built, surrounded by walls I raised, carrying memories I earned. That is enough. What I have now is solitude, not the kind that haunts, but the kind that heals. A silence I choose, rather than one forced upon me. And in that choice, I find strength that no betrayal could ever take. Sometimes I hear whispers in town about Emily. People say she's still with Mark, though barely. Others say she's distant at work, her confidence cracked. I don't ask. I don't chase rumors. That's not my war anymore. There was a time when I would have given anything to pull her back, to remind her of the nights I sat by her bed when she was sick, the sacrifices I made so she could rise. But that part of me, the desperate father, has been buried. I mourned him the same way I mourned her mother, and like grief, I learned to live with it, not to fight it. What I have now is simpler. I tend to my garden. I fix the porch steps when they creak. I sharpen my tools, polish my metals, and cook meals I actually know how to cook. I live the way I should have long ago, not for approval, not for recognition, but for peace. If Emily ever knocks on my door, I will open it. But I won't beg. I won't lecture. I won't even ask why. Some bridges are burned so completely that even if someone returns, the landscape has already changed. I don't live for what might come back. I live for what I've reclaimed, and that is more than enough. There are still moments when bitterness tries to creep in. Birthdays come and go without a call from Emily. Holidays pass without a chair pulled up beside me. The ghosts of traditions linger, whispering what once was. But when those shadows press too hard, I remind myself, Silence is better than betrayal. Absence is better than false loyalty. The emptiness at my table is honest, something her silence at that birthday dinner never was. I keep journals now, pages filled not with anger, but with memory. Stories of the Navy, of storms survived at sea, of nights under constellations that guided me home. I write down the history I once shared only in laughter around the table, so it won't vanish with me. It's my way of passing the torch on my terms, not stolen by someone else's hand. I have no illusions of reconciliation. I don't daydream about apologies. What I have now is sharper, clearer. I have truth. I have peace. I have the knowledge that when they tried to erase me, I wrote myself back into the record with evidence no one could deny. And that is a legacy far stronger than any toast raised at a birthday table. The neighbors ask sometimes if I feel lonely, living out here in the cabin by myself. I tell them the truth. No, not anymore. Loneliness is longing for someone who will not come. I don't long. I don't wait. The people who stood with me are enough, and those who didn't, I release them. That isn't loneliness. That is clarity. I fill my days with work that matters only to me. Chopping wood, repairing fences, teaching a neighbor's boy how to tie knots the Navy way. None of it makes headlines. None of it would impress Mark. And that's exactly why it feels good. It's real. At night, I sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and the water against the shore. Sometimes I lift a glass not in bitterness, not in memory of betrayal, but in honor of survival. I toast to the storms I've weathered, the battles I've won, the dignity I refuse to surrender. What I have now isn't the family I once dreamed of, but it is a life unshaken by false smiles and poisoned loyalty. It is a life of my choosing, and that, to me, is victory. The war is finished, not with a grand finale, not with applause, but with silence, steady and unbroken. The kind of silence a soldier learns to trust, the kind that means the battlefield is finally clear. Mark is a ghost now, a name no one speaks with pride, a shadow that follows Emily wherever she goes. I don't pity him. I don't hate him. I don't think of him at all. Emily remains distant. Maybe one day she will see the truth for what it was. Maybe not. Either way, it doesn't change me. Forgiveness is not mine to give. My peace doesn't depend on her remorse. I walk the cabin grounds each morning, boots pressing into soil that feels solid, earned. I breathe the air of a life I rebuilt with my own hands, free from the weight of proving myself to anyone. They wanted me erased. Instead, I endure, stronger, sharper, untouched by their silence. What I have now is freedom, and I will never look back. If this tale gave you the closure you've been waiting for, show your support with a like, subscribe, and write your age wisdom deserves to be seen.